Coming to you from the dining room table at East Barbary Lane, welcome to a very special edition of Full Circle, the podcast. I'm your host, Martha Madrigal. My guest today is truly one of my SHEroes. I first discovered her watching Screaming Queens, the riot at Compton's cafeteria, for which she won an Emmy. She has had a long and distinguished academic career, and she literally wrote the book on transgender history. Transgender History, the Roots of Today's Revolution. Please welcome Dr. Susan Stryker to the Full Circle table. Hello, Susan.
Hey.
How are you?
Hello, Martha. I'm doing well. Since you're broadcasting from Barbary Lane, it's just like, what's your relationship to Anna Madrigal?
Well, you know, as I was transitioning, and before that, Charles, my partner, said, you know, you're some wonderful combination of Martha Stewart and Anna Madrigal. And we moved to the childhood home where I grew up, and there's a wooden staircase out back by the patio that kind of goes up to the second floor. And we were sitting there watching folks, you know, kind of go up and down at a barbecue and on the wooden staircase. And he said, this really is Barbary Lane. And I said, well, it's like East Barbary Lane because we're in New Jersey. And Martha Madrigal was, you know, it was the first name given to me, just completely in love and completely accepting of who I was. So it stuck. So that's how it's connected. And we love Armistead Maupin. I mean, we did
that.
We both grooved.
Yeah, such a great story.
Yeah.
So being a San Franciscan, the Anna Madrigal character in the Tales of the City books are just near and dear to my heart. And I had a chance to ask Armistead once about the origin of that character, because there's somebody that I had come across in my research, a trans woman named Louise Lawrence, who lived in the Bay Area in the 1940s through 80s, I think it was. And, you know, she seemed very much like a real life Anna Madrigal. She rented rooms to people. She helped connect a lot of trans women to medical service providers. People might be coming out to the West Coast to, you know, get surgery or see a doctor, and she would put them up. I remember one story I read about her that when Christine Jorgensen was in San Francisco, she happened to buy a car, and Louise Lawrence drove the car back across the country to New York for Christine. You know, she just seems to be a pretty fabulous character. She's the person who introduced Alfred Kinsey to a lot of the trans women who were in his survey. So I asked Armistead, I said, could it be, you know, by chance that you met Louise Lawrence, and was that the basis for Anna Madrigal? And he said, no, actually, it was somebody who, I remember their former name. They were somebody who started out as a female impersonator, quote unquote, named Kenneth Marlowe. And I forget the name that she took after she transitioned. But Marlowe would tell stories about having been raised in a whorehouse in Nevada. Armistead met her at a fundraiser when she was transitioning called Puttin' on the Tits.
Wow.
And that he thought that she was a fabulous raconteur. That was, he said, that was the origin of some of the backstory.
Oh, I love that. Yeah, because I haven't heard that, like who it was. That's interesting. And Kate I have
Marlowe,
never heard
maybe?
of Louise Lawrence.
Well, there is actually a small nonprofit archive in San Francisco, actually in a suburb of San Francisco, Vallejo, run by the fabulous Ms. Bob Davis, who is a queen of a certain age, who made it their kind of retirement project to open their vast collection of trans historical materials to the public, and they run something that they now call the Louise Lawrence, Memorial Archive. You go look it up on the website. It's a fiscally sponsored project of the GLBT Historical Society in San Francisco, and they're fabulous, and I think it's great that they took that name to honor an unsung San Francisco trans woman of some significance.
I love that.
You might have heard of Virginia Prince.
I have heard that name.
Right. Well, Virginia Prince, the first other cross-dresser she met was Louise Lawrence. Okay. Because Louise lived in the Bay Area. She would do things like go to University of California at San Francisco, which was the medical school, and would do like these like brown bag lunches educating service providers about trans needs. She'd be like, hello, I am what she called a transvestite or a permanent transvestite. I mean, that she never had surgery, never took hormones, but she lived full time as a woman. And that was who Virginia Prince met. That Virginia Prince was had a PhD in pharmacology, was doing a postdoc at UC San Francisco, was going to these little brown bag lunches, and that's where she met the first person that she knew to be trans, and where she took her name, Virginia and Prince, were from these streets near Louise Lawrence's house, Virginia Street and Prince Street, and that is where she, that's how she became Virginia Prince. And the mailing lists for all of those old, transvestia newsletters that, all the organizations that Virginia Prince wound up starting. The original mailing list came from Louise Lawrence because she had built this network of people back in the 40s and early 50s that she would read the newspapers. She would notice somebody who was arrested for cross-dressing, man caught, in ladies' attire, blah, 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 right? And back in the day, they would publish people's names and addresses in the newspapers. And Louise Lawrence would write to them and say, like, dear, John Doe, saw your name in the paper, sucks being you, but you're not alone. And if you'd like to meet other people who,
isn't that interesting?
Are similarly inclined. Yeah. And so that's where the first subscription lists for those early transvestite, as they said in the day, newsletters came from.
It's, it's so much about the language because we didn't have the words, right. and language is still evolving very much.
Very much so. Yeah. So if as a historian, I'm using names or words that, people today go like, that's not how we say things. It's like, absolutely right.
Right.
And also, to say when Louise Lawrence would say things like, I am a permanent transvestite, it's like, well, the word transsexual had not been coined or transgender was not in use. And so, they, like, as you said, language evolves.
Right. And the person that comes to mind often is Marsha P. Johnson.
Yeah. Well, we use the word, you mentioned my film Screaming Queens.
Yes.
It's like we use the word queen rather deliberately because that was the word that people used about themselves. It's like in queen, some queens were women and some queens were men.
Right.
It's like it was a complicated category. It could be people who identified as trans women and hadn't had a chance to, fully actualize themselves yet. Like maybe they were, working in the street-based economies to try to like make their surgery and hormone money. Maybe they were guys who just, tricked in women's clothing. Maybe they were people who never intended to transition and they were living exactly how they wanted to live as a trans feminine person. So, but the word queen was the word that described that entire group of people, usually who were involved in some street culture of some of some kind.
Right.
So yeah, so now we say, Marcia and Sylvia, they were the, foremothers of our movement. It's like they use the word queen and they use the word transvestite about themselves. Street transvestite action
Right.
revolutionaries.
Right. And Sylvia, I
So
think even more than Marcia, from the way I understand it, Marcia would sometimes present as male, would sometimes
yeah.
be out there, with her male name. And sometimes was
Mhm.
he and him.
Yeah, and well, Sylvia too. It's like she got really disgruntled with gay community in New York by the, early 1970s, and she moved off. She was upstate. She was using the name Ray
Oh,
again, was mostly working as a man. I mean, was, never closeted about being gay and genderqueer and certainly never hid her
right.
past. But, she lived for a long time, again, in a more male presenting way. And then later in life, she was like, no, like this isn't right. And she, kind of came back out as Sylvia
Right.
once more. So both Marcia and Sylvia went in and out of presenting in a more trans-ish kind of way.
Right. Right. It's interesting. And Sylvia it felt like she had her moment kind of in the sun toward the end of her life. That she,
Exactly. I was just really glad that she was in some ways rediscovered by a younger generation
yeah,
of
she
people.
had that time
Um,
of being celebrated. Was it England or was it Italy where they brought her over for Pride?
it was in Italy.
Italy. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I had when I went to do some work with some of the trans folks in Bologna, Italy, which is an amazing place, an amazing community of people there. They very proudly, trotted out photos of Sylvia
Oh,
and of
wow.
Leslie Feinberg, who they had brought
Okay.
to work with them. What one of the things that I remember about Starr, I mean, remember in the sense of being a historian who's studied, is like I found this pamphlet or, flyer once where they were making their demands for, what they wanted. And it, said something like, in every city of 1 million people, there needs to be a clinic dedicated to, trans people. And it's like, there needs to be doctors on site, and there need to be job placement programs, and there needs to be, this, that, and the other. And there needs to be something that helps people who've been incarcerated. It's like, boom, 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 like
Right.
this 10-point program that they had. And that is exactly what they had in Bologna. It's like the city government, because it used to be they called it Red Bologna for a reason and not just for the red tile roofs. It's like that
Okay.
it was a stronghold of leftist politics, and the left-leaning government of Bologna was like totally supportive of trans rights. They gave the trans community a building. It's like they gave the gay community a building, but they also recognized that trans issues overlapped but were different. And there was a separate trans organization, MIT, the stood for Movimento Italiano Transessuale initially, and then they changed it to mean like movement of Italian transgender people. They changed what the logo meant. But the MIT building in Bologna, it was owned by this organization that served trans people. They had like drop-in medical clinics. They had job placement stuff. Everybody who worked there was formerly incarcerated, and this was like a job for them, to get going. They had a hormone clinic. They had surgical referrals. They had counseling sessions. They had social events. They ran a film festival. It's like it was amazing. And they were in a sense like doing exactly what Sylvia and Starr back in the day said should be done. And, they managed to do it well before we've ever managed to do something like that in the
It's
US.
incredible to me what happens when we actually listen to the people involved. And that's across the board. But, it sounds like, wow, they actually listened to trans people about what our needs and, you know, how we would serve our community and how we would best act. In watching all of the legislation and counter legislation around conversion therapy, the one place that really kind of gave me heart was New Zealand, because New Zealand is one of the very few places who actually seemed to get it right and said, this also has to apply to religion. You know, we can't exempt religion because that's where most of this damage is happening. And they got there by listening to the folks who were most impacted. And they've done that over with some different legislation too, you know, in terms of sex work, in terms of actually listening to the people involved and saying, you know, what would keep you safe? What do you need from your government? Imagine that as a concept.
Imagine that, a government saying, we're here for the people. You know, that's why government exists. You know, it's like, what do the people need? How can life be better?
That's what I thought. That's what, you know, I hold on to that. I hold on to that ideal. You know, as I was reading, there were some names in transgender history. The first one that really struck me was Reed Erickson, who is another person I had never known about until I read the book.
He was amazing. I mean, I first, I mean, as a young trans thing, when I was first starting to, you know, sniff around and look for information back in the later, probably not later 70s. I hadn't found anything by then, but sort of early 80s. I would come across these pamphlets that said, you know, the legal aspects of transsexualism, you know, put out by the Erickson Educational Foundation. Like, what is that? You know, and there was a whole series of self-help pamphlets. It's like, you know, how to legally change your name, you know, Erickson Educational Foundation. Yeah. And by the time I started, you know, being a serious historian of the trans movement and of trans people's lives, mostly in North America, mostly in the parts of North America that are now the United States. It was at that time in the early 90s that I learned who was this person behind the Erickson Educational Foundation, and his name was Reed Erickson. He went by Eric Erickson, or just Erickson most of the time. He was a trans man. He transitioned in, I think, 1962. He was fabulously wealthy. His father was an electrical engineer, and that he had sent Erickson, the son, you know, to kind of learn the family business. Erickson was the first person assigned female at birth to get a master's degree in engineering from Louisiana State University. Right. And what they were doing in Louisiana, because the family was based mostly in Philadelphia, was that they ran a business called Schuylkill Industries. Right. that took old car batteries, extracted the lead from them, and then sold the lead to the petroleum industry as a fuel additive. I mean, not exactly like a, you know, green economy kind of guy, right? But you know, maybe they didn't know quite so much back in the 1940s and 50s. But that the reason they were in Louisiana is that's where the oil industry was that they were working with. And then they eventually got into oil and gas leasing, and they became quite wealthy. I mean, not only from the industry, but from all of the collateral stuff that they were doing around it. And yeah, Erickson lived most of his younger life as a, you know, sort of a dashing butch lesbian. I've seen photos of him before his transition, and you know, it's like, I mean, think about him as this socialite butch moving in very, you know, high-powered circles in New York, and like dating people who were like the children of members of the Roosevelt administration and prominent banking families. I mean, like he moved in these very, very fast
He was
circles.
almost the gentleman Jack of the 20th century.
The gentleman Jack of the 20th century, or I think of him kind of like, Tony Stark, Iron Man kind of guy. He was an inventor. He was wealthy. He thought outside the box about everything. Well, when his father died and he inherited the family business, he was like, all right, actually, I'm a guy. And he is the one who funded all of the doctors who were doing the research. It's like,
that was the part that
like,
got to I mean, those early programs that were so important, like Johns Hopkins, like Stanford,
Hopkins, UCLA, Stanford, the University of Texas, Galveston. So Erickson was the money bags behind the doctors who were doing the research. He's the person who bankrolled Harry Benjamin's foundation that funded the publication of the transsexual phenomenon. I mean, it's like he also funded the One Institute for Homophile Studies in Los Angeles, which was a gay advocacy organization founded by this guy Dor Legg, which amassed this amazing library and archive of queer historical materials that's now part of the special collections at University of Southern California. But Erickson was just super influential in early homophile activism, in the provision of healthcare for trans people, for the development of what we would now call the medical model. He kind of orchestrated that, and I think of it as, there a lot of people who aren't trans can get their knickers in a twist about trans people, but most of them don't really care about, like, what can we do to make the life of trans people better? And Erickson was the one going like, yeah, there needs to be something happening here. How can I use my money to make that happen? And he is the person who put all of that in place to put the medical model in place as a way of serving trans people, not of just sort of studying trans people as freaks somehow. So, thank you, Reed Erickson, for all of that. The thing that I am most fascinated about with him, though, is that, like I said, he was an engineer, but he was also somebody who had serious interests in esoteric and occult religions. He had a lot of, what you might call New Age beliefs, and so he said, we can take kind of an engineering approach to transsexualism. You can say, like, what, it's like, it's not rocket science. It's like shoot these drugs in your body. It's like, cut and staple here, turn this inside out, move this tissue here to there. It's like, it's just engineering, it's a physical thing. And then it's like, you sign here to change the legal, documents and whatever. It's just like, it's just a technical problem. It's not, it's like, nobody needs to lose their mind over this. Right. And you can do that. So that's what he called, like, physical transsexualism. But then he said there's also something called spiritual transsexualism that for him was all about how you develop and elevate your consciousness and awareness. And he was like totally into psychedelic drugs, and and what he thought of as like East-West fusion religion, and he funded people who were doing work and like ethnobotanicals, like, how is it that tribes in the highlands of Mexico, it's like, use traditional plant medicines to do their sacred practices. So, I mean, he was totally into all of that back in the 60s,
right?
In the 60s mostly. And for me, like, that is well, I will just say, like, as somebody who has gone through a medical transition, I totally appreciate what has been available to me.
Sure.
But I also just really get a kick out of how the same person who helped orchestrate all of that also saw a completely different way of being trans. And, for me, it's just saying like, there is no one way to be a trans person.
Right.
And, it should be a big tent kind of concept. I think within the community, we should not be quite as turf marking and boundary policing as we can be about, who's a real what and which thing is preferable to which other thing, and just say, it's like Ben Franklin would say, if we don't all hang together, we're all going to hang separately.
Well, right, and
right?
I couldn't agree with that more. And it's.
Yeah.
I feel like I'm beating a drum with that, on every platform that I have, which is, there's not a right or a way wrong to being trans. This is an inside job. You're trans because you say you're trans. Because throughout history, we've had more folks who didn't or couldn't transition, or there was no such thing, than we've had the folks who've had access, and then to say that there's now some hierarchy doesn't make a lot of sense. I have Elizabeth Coffey Williams is a very good friend of mine. And Elizabeth had her confirmation surgery, I want to say in 1972 in Baltimore, 72 or 73. And, she was from Philadelphia. She, came out to her parents I think the day she graduated high school, and they put her outside. And she found out about the gender clinic at Johns Hopkins and moved to Baltimore, where she met John Waters and the Dreamlanders, and she wound up in 4 of his films. In fact, it's Elizabeth in Pink Flamingos who is the trans flasher. That's Elizabeth. And she was in, I think a total of 4 of his films. But, she tells the story of when she went to Johns Hopkins, they didn't want to help her because she didn't fit their model of what it was to be trans. And, she was already living as herself. And, she was in little short shorts and tank tops or halter tops or whatever. And, one of the things that you agreed to, you weren't allowed to meet any of the other trans folk being served in the clinic. They weren't allowed to know one another. And there was this agreement at that time that you wouldn't talk about it. Your goal was to go, assimilate. And she said, all I need you to do is fix this little problem I have. That's all I need you for. You do this thing that I need because, my pants will look better. That's it. That's all I need from you. Mm-hmm. And it took a long time. And I think she finally accosted one of the surgeons. And I want to say Moon or Mooney, but I'm probably getting that wrong. In the gift shop.
Oh, there was John Money.
I think it was John Money.
Who was not he was called himself a psychoneuroendocrinologist.
Okay.
He wasn't the surgeon.
But he was the one who she finally got in the coffee shop or the gift shop or somewhere and pleaded once again. And he went back to the folks and said, she's exactly who we're here to help. Even though she didn't fit their idea of, what she should be. She wasn't going to go be Donna Reed. She was going to go be Janis Joplin. That was, and she was going to tell people, she's been out since then.
I would love to put her in touch with people I know at Johns Hopkins. There's a faculty member there, Jules Gill Peterson, who works on who is trans and works on trans history, and I'm sure that she would love to interview.
That would be great. Yeah, I think she'd be very willing to do that because, she talks openly about it. And what was interesting? Talk about.
Yeah, it's it just slays me today how you listen to the right wing and it's trans people did not exist before 2018.
Yeah, apparently.
And right, just it's a new thing. It's a social contagion. But it's just like there are so many people who are still around who have decades and decades and decades of life experience as trans.
Absolutely.
And, I think it would be great in the current political moment to just have and pardon my French, just a bunch of old trannies, out there like talking about what it was like back in the day.
I agree. I agree.
Yeah. So nothing new under the sun.
Yeah.
Right?
And I'm so thankful for them. And, they were instrumental. I was just so fortunate to get to know Elizabeth and Claudia Haddad and others, who really kind of got my mind around this whole thing. It's like, honey, you're just trans. Just relax, and there's not a one way to do it.
Come on in, the water's fine.
Basically, I would have moments and, she would just kind of slap me out of it, and I think I always say we need trans friends. We need them. We need the folks with whom we just have a shorthand, that we just understand one another. At least
100%.
Yeah. On that basic level. And Elizabeth got mentioned in Disclosure, the documentary, right, about trans folks in film. And what happened was, Jen Richards actually brought up her story. So Jen was being interviewed. And when they were talking about, erasure and early erasure, Elizabeth had interviewed several times to play the character of Elizabeth Eden. And Sidney Lumet loved her and wanted to hire her. And, she even had herself looking very much like Elizabeth Eden. And then the money folks got involved. And,
and made it Michael Sarandon.
At Chris Sarandon. Yeah. And Chris Sarandon's career was launched.
Chris Sarandon. Excuse me.
Yeah, launched from
Made it.
Yeah.
Chris Sarandon. That's right. Yeah.
And that's when she stopped acting. She said, "You know what? I've had enough. It's okay." Because if ever there was a part, she was born literally to play. It was that
born to play.
Yeah. And no, that, of course, the only way to portray a trans woman is with a cis dude in a
who needs a shave.
Thank you. Who needs a shave? You took the words. Who needs a shave?
But wears a pink bathrobe and has long nails and is crazy.
Yeah, right. Because that made sense to folks.
Because that's exactly who Al Pacino would fall in love with.
Yeah.
Right.
And yet here was Elizabeth, who was this trans woman who was already thriving and, already alive and well regarded and living her life in Philadelphia. And she had been in Baltimore. She was in San Francisco for a while. She didn't look the part. And she's like, well, God damn it.
I'm sorry, you look like a woman. It's like we need a transsexual.
As did Elizabeth Eden. And it was like we put pictures of the two of them side by side at the time, and it was almost eerie.
Yeah, no, I've seen pictures of her. So she was...
Yeah. And so nothing is new. And, I read Transgender History several years ago. I want to say when the revised edition came out. So 2017, right? 2017? Yeah. So, and I reread it just in preparation to sit down with you. And I'm taken again that, even TERFism, even this gender critical nonsense that, feels new to a lot of trans people isn't new. This stuff is not new. And, the Janice Raymond was, selling this stuff how long ago? Late 80s, early 90s?
Yeah. Well, yeah, like her book came out in 1979.
Okay.
Transsexual Empire. But where Raymond winds up with at the end of that book, because there's this famous line in it where she says, the problem of transsexualism would best be solved by morally mandating it out of existence.
Yeah, right.
And it's like that's almost like word for word what Michael Knowles, the right wing infotainment fascist, person who was speaking at CPAC
Mm-hmm.
recently, who said, transgenderism should be mandated out of existence.
Yeah.
And people said, that's genocidal. And he says, it can't be genocidal because it's like trans people don't actually even exist. It's not a real thing. And
Yeah.
But it's like whether he knew it or not, and I think he probably knew it. Um, he was almost directly quoting this transphobic feminist from 40 plus years ago.
Yeah.
Um, and I say probably knew it because I do research on the history of the transphobic right as well as transgender communities and people themselves. And I will say that to use that us and them language, it's like they know far more about us than we know about them. They read things. It's like I read like literally like anti-Semitic, pro-Nazi, fascist conspiracy theory stuff, and like they cite things that that you know that that most people who share my politics don't read what the right is actually doing. And when I look at what the right is doing, their arguments, their talking points, it's like look at the bibliographies and their books. It's just like they read. And I think we need to educate ourselves far more about how they frame our issues based on these like very long-standing transphobic tropes and memes and discourses.
I'm glad you do it. That's hard. That's hard for me, and I absorb a lot of news, and I do try to pay attention to what they're doing. But I have to, I confess, I get that news from mainstream news sources. I don't go where they read because that's waiting somewhere that I don't like to be. And, it's hard. It's really hard because you're right. It's important to know what they're saying and what they're doing. And I keep saying, if this fails politically, they'll knock it off, or at least to this degree, I think.
I think you're right. I mean, they're definitely throwing the spaghetti to the wall and seeing if it'll stick right now. And that, there has been a persistent strand of transphobia within other social movements in this country. It's like it's not new, but that what is new, I think, is the traction that it's getting right now, and the way that a major political party in cahoots with well-funded evangelical Christians, as well as like far right-wing reactionary people, there is this weird amalgamation of interests that are transphobic for their own particular reasons that are all cross-pollinating each other right now, and that the organized political right has found these very effective talking points against trans people, many of which were first kind of workshopped in transphobic, lesbian, feminist, separatist communities back in the 70s. And they're, trotting them out as campaign tools right now. One of the other kind of cross-pollinizations that I've seen is that so much of that early turfy feminism, the people who were promulgating it were former Catholics, Mary Daly, Janice Raymond, and a lot of their arguments are rooted in a sort of a version of Catholic theology, like notions of natural and moral law and ideas about bodily integrity and what is the body for and what's God's purpose for the body, and that's why you're not supposed to have abortions and use contraception. It's like it's sort of the same framework, and I think we don't really see that. I mean, we don't make that connection as easily as we might, because Daly and Raymond they both renounced not only Catholicism, but Christianity, and developed a more sort of goddess-centered feminist religion. But it's like, as I read them, it's like they imported a lot of very conservative Catholic theology, by another name, into some of the ways that they thought and acted, and particularly the way that these sort of conservative Catholic ideas inform their position on trans people and provide a sort of intellectual or moral basis to their argument. But it's in that sort of turfy feminism had been around in the 70s and 80s. But what happened in the 90s was that there were a lot of powerful, mostly Catholic interests under the Pope at the time was personally pretty transphobic, and that there was a lot of concern over how these big international conferences that were put on by the United Nations about on women's rights, international women's rights, that there was a shift in that language between like women's rights to gender rights, and wanting to talk about gender discrimination rather than discrimination against women. And there were a bunch of people, it's like these conservative Catholics, a lot of African evangelical Christians, white, mostly Western European and North American feminists who were involved in anti-trafficking work. They all kind of cross-pollinated with each other in Beijing in 1995 at this UN conference on women. There was a conservative Catholic writer named Dale O'Leary who published a book right there called what was it called? Gender ideology, the deconstruction of women. It's like, and so you start to see this argument. It's like when you say gender, but you mean women, like that's this like false ideological construction that just erases the biological specificity of women. And it's part of this, global Northern Western secular elite thing that's like wanting to destroy God's plan for the family. It's like, and you can just start to see this cluster around 1995 where everything that is just blossoming in full noxious, bloom right now. It's like the seeds of all that come together about 25 years ago. And it kind of percolated along in a more subterranean way for a while. But then in the context of I think in the U.S., the thing that really let the genie out of the bottle, so to speak, was the Obama presidency, because you had all of these racists with like
broke them.
Obama derangement syndrome, and like they just could not wrap their head around a black man as president of the United States. And, you've got Sarah Palin, who's running on the Republican ticket. And she's the one, I think, who more than anybody else started saying, what I consider to be the, crazy conspiratorial, racist, batshit crazy wingnut stuff out loud and in public as part of a very, highly televised and, mass mediafied presidential campaign. And I think that was the thing that really like gave permission for people to start doubling down on that in the public sphere. And then the organized right, it's like they're going like, yeah, we're losing on gay marriage. It's like we're in a rear guard action here. We lost on gays in the military. It's like the trans thing. It's like it's complicated. It's divisive. We can really use this. And for in some ways, I think since about 2007, 8, with the about passing ENDA, the Employment Non-Discrimination Act, I think we started to see the right wing field testing ideas about how to use transgender as a wedge to split the left, and you wind up with Barney Frank actually like cutting trans people out of, employment, into Employment Non-Discrimination Act. Then you got the bathroom bills. You started to see a little bit of anti-trans rhetoric in the 2016 Republican primary. It didn't really become much of an issue in the election between Trump and Clinton. It's like at that level, there wasn't a lot of, chatter about trans, but in the Republican primaries leading up to that, you had people like Mike Pence and Ted Cruz who were definitely, saying a lot of the anti-trans stuff that's gone much more mainstream. But then it really wasn't until, Trump is out, Biden is in, that the right seems to have really lost its mind. And to orchestrated a very deliberate campaign. I mean, I don't know if you've been following this. It's like, it's hard to not sound like you are a conspiracy theorist, right?
Know.
But there was this dump of email and text message communications that fed into a story that was published in Mother Jones of, something like 2,600 pages of material from this person who had been trans, detransitioned, started working with the right wing, as a, detransitioner, saying like, this is all bad, but then go like, oh, no. It's like, I was wrong about that too, retransitioned. And after they retransitioned, they gave to, left-wing journalists all of the paper trail of the conversations that they had been involved in with, people from Alliance Defending Families and, other right-wing groups and Republican elected officials in state houses. There was this one particular legislator in North Dakota who seemed to play a pretty key role in trying to promote legislation that had been drafted like by Alliance Defending Families. They would develop model legislation. They would feed it to this guy. He would work with other legislators in other states. And that there was a deliberate campaign to roll out very similar kinds of legislation at the state level across every state where Republicans control the legislatures. So it's, the anti-drag stuff, the save the children, sports stuff, anti, like banning affirmative care for people who are under the age of 18, or even in like Missouri, just like trying to ban trans health care at all, although there's been a temporary stay put on that for now. In Texas, saying that, Child Protective Services should investigate families that are supportive of their trans kids. I mean, it is a full-on war on trans.
Well, it is. And in Texas,
right
what is interesting, because they were kind of early adapters of a lot of this legislation. And then, of course, Chase Strangio, who we should all pray for, to whatever and whomever we pray, knocked so much of that back, and they were ultimately not successful, that then the attorney general and the governor got together and said, well, how can we screw with trans people? It's like, well, we can't do it legally, so let's do it this way by edict. And
they're doing it the way that they do it, through control of the administrative apparatus of the state. But the thing that really concerns me is the way that in states where there is a Republican supermajority in the legislature, or where they control both houses and the governor's office, that they're just doing flat out undemocratic things. It's like they're just like refusing to seat people who are duly elected to represent their constituents.
Right.
It's like, I'm sorry, you believe the wrong thing. We're just going to like kick you out of the legislature.
So I have a little bit of a theory here. I mean, because, you said there's a connection between trans rights and reproductive rights and the fight for either. And I believe that they are very much connected.
Absolutely. I mean, it is about bodily
Right.
autonomy. It is about the control of your own reproductive anatomy. And it's about saying that your body is for you to live through it, not as a resource for the state or somebody else's religion.
Right. And it's interesting to me to see the pushback, when abortion comes on the ballot now. So they got their Supreme Court to do what they wanted, with overturning Roe. But then, they got emboldened. So you're seeing states like Kansas say hell no when they get the chance to vote on it. And I saw a recent survey. I want to say it was Gallup, but I'm not sure about that, where 53% of registered Republicans said the anti-trans legislation is going too far.
Right. Yeah, no, I saw that too. It was actually, believe it or not, a Fox News poll.
There we go.
Right. And so, yeah, I think it was like 57%, said anti-trans legislation going too far is a major problem. And then like another 26%, I think it was, said it was a minor problem. But only so like 86% of people thought it was a problem at some level, and only 15% said it wasn't a problem at all, and only I think like 3% said like I don't know. I mean, it's something that pretty much everybody has an opinion about.
Oh yeah.
That only a diehard minority supports, and that 86% of the population thinks it is somewhat of a problem.
Do you think this
more than half of the people think it's a bad problem?
Is this the last gasp of the far right ideology, or is it just going to come back in a different way?
I'm pretty cynical.
Okay.
Just like there was a saying I heard in I think it was actually a Milos Forman film, this like Czech filmmaker, where one of the characters says, nothing is so good that it couldn't be better, and nothing is so bad that it couldn't be worse. And I think, yeah, that's probably true. I had a friend I was emailing with yesterday or today about that poll that you just mentioned. And, she said, what we really need now is our, Senator, have you no decency moments.
I agree.
Like in the Red Scare back in the 1950s, which was horrible. It's like I think what's happening right now on trans issues is as horrible as that. And there was, totally a panic around communism and communists in the government and infiltrating everything, and the blacklist in Hollywood. I mean, people lost their jobs, wrecked their careers, ruined their lives over the Red Scare and the blacklist. And, we're seeing things like that happen to trans people now. But that moment, in the House Un-American Activities Committee hearing that McCarthy is, trying to like call everybody a communist and kick them out of government, you had guys who's like, Senator, have you no decency? And
I love that,
it kind of, it hit the moment where a lot of people kind of put the brakes on and were like, right, this is like totally out of hand. And you started to see it unwind a little bit. And so, I hope something like that happens.
Well, you talked about
on trans,
the pendulum, and I think there is one. So I am hopeful. Because these clips do go viral. I think part of the problem is the saturation of everything. We're so inundated with all of the information, but I've seen some remarkable speeches. I've seen some impassioned parents, and I've even seen a couple of, Republican state legislators say, I cannot do this to human beings. It's beyond our scope. It's beyond our purview.
Yeah, well, it seems like the governor of Montana, which just passed some of the more draconian legislation, his own child is non-binary
It's not a me.
and has talked to their dad saying like, Dad, like, don't do this to me and my community. And he was like, I don't know, it's like, I got to get reelected. And so I think as long as there is uh, foaming at the mouth base of rabid transphobes in the Republican Party, I think they're going to continue doing this at least through 2024.
Yeah.
And it's like it. But to your point about abortion, it's like there has definitely been a mobilization against the overturning of Roe v. Wade, and it hasn't played well for the Republicans, thank God.
Oh yeah.
And it's like I think that we could conceivably see something like that happening, of people saying like, this anti-trans thing is batshit crazy and it's just wrong, and honestly I don't really care that much about trans people, but it's like we need to kind of get off this thing right now. It's like, and stop obsessing over it, and it's not the problem that they're thinking it is, and blah blah blah. So I think we'll see how it plays out over the next 18 months. I don't imagine that it will abate until second week of November of 2024 in the best of all circumstances.
Right.
But hopefully it will not be uh, uh, it will not be the wedge or the accelerant that the right hopes it will be. It's like that they have to overplayed their hand.
I mean, I think that's
because it. Yeah,
I think it's part of why we
go
didn't
ahead.
have that red wave. They took the House. They didn't take the Senate. We gained in the Senate.
Right.
But they didn't. What is their? They have 5 extra seats, 10. I mean, it's something that if somebody coughs wrong, it could shift. And so,
Right.
I think this at least has something to do with it. I think Roe probably has more to do with it. And I'm wondering if.
Yeah, and then no, I mean, I think you're right. But I think the other thing that we really have to be mindful of is the really racially motivated voter suppression and the gerrymandering. It's like, because they're just they are trying to orchestrate a political system that locks in a kind of minoritarian rule. And when you look at like these polls that we've just been talking about, where most people actually oppose what it is that they're doing and the way they're using trans issues in to do it, the only way they can hold on to power is through these repressive, anti-democratic actions that game the system in particular ways to get non-majoritarian outcomes.
Yeah. It's scary.
Yeah, it is scary. But I'm going to need to probably start winding this down in a little bit.
I'm watching the clock.
But it's been a great conversation. Really have appreciated the free flowing nature of it all.
I'm wrapped.
What was I going to say? One of the things that I tell young people today is like, first of all, it's like, don't give up. Just like the only thing that has ever changed the course of political history is like mass mobilizations of people, at some level becoming ungovernable and, compelling change to happen. And, we as the people always have that as a tool in our toolkit, if we can get people moving in the right direction. So don't give up hope. And second, it's like, there are still people out there who are persuadable, and that we need to be talking to those people, need to be doing our education and outreach work. But that, there's no question that we now have a whole lot more work to do. And I mean, that I feel like a lot of the work that people in my generation did has been undone at the level of civil rights and of healthcare access. But the flip side of that coin is to say, well, we made some progress, and now there's been a rollback, but I know that you have the same capacity to do that work. I know that that work can be done. And the other thing I would say is that, it totally sucks to be criminalized, to be denied access to care, to have your families and jobs and housing at risk just because you're trans. But at the end of the day, it's that is the world that I grew up in. It's
Right.
I grew up as a person trying to figure out how to deal with being trans in the 60s and 70s and 80s. And when I transitioned, in the late 80s, early 90s, the world that I was coming into at that time, it's by saying that I was trans, it's you could be 5150'd, you could lose access to your kids, you could be busted by the cops for walking while trans,
Yes.
You had no employment discrimination. Most trans healthcare services were not provided, were not covered by insurance. There was a lot of gatekeeping. There was very little information. And so that wasn't good, but I can also say it's survivable. Just we as trans people are strong people who find our way.
Yeah.
And that, it's you can be yourself to yourself. You can be free in your heart and strong in your self-knowledge, and nobody can take that away from you. However hard the external circumstances are, just you can find that place of self-validation, if nothing else.
Amen. Absolutely.
And I just feel like there's no going back, really, to what things were like half a century ago. I mean, we might face really hard political repression that makes our life very, very difficult, but something has changed in the attitude of people. I mean, I think younger people today have a very different orientation to gender.
Absolutely. And one another's gender identity and one another's sexuality. There's a lot. It's so much more open and so much more free flowing.
Yeah. And I don't want to put words in their mouths or, frame what they're doing in ways that they wouldn't do it themselves. But when I look at it, what I see particularly around the emergence of non-binary identities is that, I mean, I think there's some people who are going to I want to present in a really, mixed or androgynous way, or, I have an identity as a non-binary person. Sure. But, I also see people who, if they didn't tell me they identified as non-binary, I wouldn't know that about them.
Sure.
Is that it's almost like it's like a political stance or as much as anything else. And I think, and that's not to say that it's not legitimate, but what I see is a lot of people using the concept of non-binary to essentially say, I'm opposed to a compulsory gender binary, that's what I'm rejecting. And that it's as much of saying I think of, it's I know what my body is, but I'm choosing to express myself in some way that doesn't depend on being part of a, biologically defined gender binary. That's what I'm rejecting. And, I think that's cool. I think we have a really different attitude in society today, in large parts of it, to the idea of a compulsory gender binary predicated on biology. It's that's what's shifted. That's what people are rejecting.
Well, and you just inadvertently brought this back full circle, because we started the conversation talking about the language. And I think non-binary identities, we have a language for that now. I've got several friends who identified as lesbians or even identified as gay, and male, and said that never fit. But I knew that I was not a trans man or a trans woman. But then I heard this language and I heard these kids talking about it. And I went, that is what I am. That is what I always was. And they, them is what fits for me. And now we have the language for it. I want to close with just one. As I was rereading today, I came across a passage that is it read as poetry to me. And I think our existence is an act of resistance. I think there are a lot of ways to do it. And you started talking about, someone I really enjoy. And the passage says, as Big Frida's successful music career demonstrates, not all forms of trans resistance have to be somberly militant to be influential. When trans and gender nonconforming lives are lived joyously and unapologetically in plain sight, or their hard truths and dangers are spoken out loud, when the knowledge that comes from living those lives is channeled into music and dance, written about and written from, played with and fantasized over, when their beauty and weirdness, their sharp edges and dark recesses are creatively explored and collectively experienced, that is equally as important as heavy political activism. I love that passage.
Oh, you know what? I do too. I thought it's like I haven't read that book since I wrote that
I
book.
know.
And yeah, that was it's like, hey, Susan, you nailed that.
You
one.
really did.
Good on me.
Good on you.
And I remember. I remember doing the revisions for that first edition of the book came out in 2008, I think. And the publisher asked for, an updated version. Could you just add a new chapter? And I thought, no, I need to, because things change so much. I think I need to do like a global revision and sort of update it throughout. But writing that last chapter, it's like I wrote it, in like December and January, like December of 2016 and January of 2017. It's like I wrote it in the immediate aftermath of the Trump election.
Right.
I mean, the reason the book ends with the Women's March in Washington, because like that happened like the weekend before I turned the book manuscript in the next week, so like that's where it stopped. When we really had no sense at that time how you had a sense that it was going to get bad and weird under Trump, but you didn't know exactly how bad or how weird or for how long. And I was like, it was just such an open book at that point. So, I think I was writing from this place of like really radical vulnerability, and like real of just, trying to say like, it's like, here we are, like we got to live, like we got to find our joy. We've got to, it's like can't let this bullshit just live rent free in your head. You've got to just,
because if we don't have joy, what is the point? Right.
Exactly. And maybe this will be the thing that I end on, because I'm gonna have to go. Gotcha. But that, like Reed Erickson, who we were speaking of earlier, it's like I too am a person who will, from time to time, experience. I'll have. I use psychedelics. That's what I'm getting at.
Cool.
And I do it, with some intentionality and regularity. And there was one time, I think it was a ketamine trip where I saw this banner that's just like across my mind's eye. And the banner said, "The meaning of life is to experience joy as we move towards death." It's like, we don't get, like nobody here gets out alive, right? It's just like, we are going to die at some point, and we should not be in denial about that. But if you don't experience joy in that passage towards the inevitability of death. It's just like, what's the point of being here, right?
Agreed. On that note,
all right.
I want to thank you so much for your time. I have thoroughly enjoyed this.
Likewise.
Please come back anytime. We would love to hear from you.
Just hit me up. I'm around.
I appreciate this so much. Susan Stryker, thank you for joining us at the Full Circle table. Have a great night.
It's been my pleasure. All right, you too. Bye-bye.
Full Circle is a Never Scared Productions podcast, hosted by Charles Tyson Jr. and Martha Madrigal, produced and edited by Never Scared, executive produced by Charles Tyson Jr. and Martha Madrigal. Our theme and music is by the Jingleberries. All names, pictures, music, audio, and video clips are registered trademarks and/or copyrights of their respective copyright holders.